I think as everybody knows, we're celebrating the Department of Transportation's 40th anniversary this year. The 40th anniversary came and went on April the 1st, but DOT was in the process of transitioning from its old headquarters at the NASIF building, headquarters, by the way, that didn't exist when the department was created, but which we now call the old headquarters, to our new headquarters. You're not supposed to outlive a building, I didn't think, but we do that in this day and age. And so we could not do any kind of celebration at that time, and then there are a million reasons why it was difficult to do along the way. It finally was decided that we would do it in connection with the annual DOT holiday party, which gives us an opportunity to bring some alumni together, together with our present workforce, and after we get through reminiscing about the beginning of the department and thinking about the future of the department, we'll all be able to move into the big atrium just adjacent to this space and enjoy some refreshments. The Secretary Peters will be recognizing all of the former secretaries who have come back to join us, and in addition to Secretary Boyd and Secretary Coleman, we have a few others who will be in the party, I believe. So thank you for coming with us. We are going to have two panel discussions. The first will be the panel you see before you. I think Chairman Oberstar is planning to join this panel, but was hung up in Congress with some votes, and so he will join us hopefully before very long. And then a second panel to look at how the department has done on the intermodal front. The intermodal imperative was at the heart of the Department of Transportation Act, as everybody remembers. The General Accounting Office, or the Government Accountability Office, I should say, has just done a report about the department's performance in that regard, and the author of that report will be with us, and we'll have some others thinking about where the department is going, how we've done in the past, and where we might go in the future. We'll have a roving mic. I hope that this will be an interactive proceeding. I will tell you, too, that we are manufacturing a DVD of this session. So if you are behind in your alimony payments or trying to dodge a process server for any other reason, you might want to keep it zipped during the exchange, but otherwise we hope you'll participate actively. Let me introduce this very interesting and distinguished panel that we have before us. We are extraordinarily privileged to have Alan Boyd with us. Alan, of course, was the first Secretary of Transportation. He flew cargo planes for the Army Air Corps in the Second World War. He practiced law in Florida. He was the chairman of the Florida Railroad and Public Utilities Commission. He became chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board, then an undersecretary of Commerce for Transportation, eventually selected by President Johnson as the guy to put the Department of Transportation together, and then was nominated and confirmed as the first secretary. Since that time, he has been the president of the Illinois Central Railroad. He's been the president of Amtrak. He's been the president and chairman, I believe, of Airbus Industry of North America. He's had a distinguished career in transportation and brings a tremendous amount of experience with him. I'm just jumping around a little bit. Langhorne Bond is at the end. I've just sort of put these together very quickly. Alan Langhorne was chief of staff, or the equivalent of a chief of staff to Alan. He was an assistant secretary for public affairs at UMTA in that very first experience of the Department of Transportation. He then went on to become a director of the National Transportation Center in Pittsburgh, was appointed the Illinois Secretary of Transportation under two different governors of Illinois and two different parties, I might add, which is saying something. And at that time, he was president of AASHTO. He became the FAA administrator during the Carter administration, has had a long career in aviation in the private sector ever since, and is currently the distinguished president of the International Loran Association. Cecil Mackey was associate professor of economics at the Air Force Academy. He moved from there to the University of Alabama, his alma mater, to lecture in business law, somehow got a law degree at the same time. I don't know how you do that, Cecil, quite remarkable. He studied law at the graduate level at Harvard, and then he joined the staff of the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly. Went to the FAA as the Director of Policy Development in 1963, went on to the Commerce Department in 65 in a similar position, and then became under Secretary Boyd DOT's first Assistant Secretary for Policy. The rest of his career has been devoted to teaching and administration. He has served as the president of the University of South Florida, Texas Tech University, and Michigan State, which he headed for 6 years. He continues to teach. He commutes to Dubai on a regular basis, I understand, and continues to be very active. Secretary Bill Coleman. Bill was the fourth Secretary of Transportation, only the second African American to serve in the Cabinet of the United States. After graduating summa from Penn, he went on to Harvard Law School, where he was first in his class, and he did that despite the fact that he took 3 years off to serve in the Army Air Corps. He then clerked for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and then he clerked for Justice Felix Frankfurter, where he became lifelong friends with the late Elliot Richardson, who was a classmate and who was serving at the same time as another clerk for Justice Frankfurter. Secretary Coleman soon became a distinguished Philadelphia lawyer who, with Thurgood Marshall, played a major role in significant civil rights cases, including Brown versus Board of Education. On leaving the Department of Transportation, he returned to Philadelphia, but subsequently became a partner in the Washington office of the Los Angeles-based firm of O'Melveny and Myers. Secretary Coleman was a senior consultant and assistant counsel to the Warren Commission. That's where he first met President Ford before becoming secretary, and has a long list of public policy accomplishments, I would say, as long as your arm. He's argued about 19 different cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, and in 1966 he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor that is given to civilians by the United States. I would begin the proceedings by asking Secretary Boyd if he would like to offer some remarks about the beginning of the department's history. Secretary Boyd.
Thank you, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that all of you are very well versed in transportation lore and law. In fact, I may say it is possible that I may make some misstatements about one or another, or all three, but happily, with Cecil Mackey and Langer and Bond here to straighten you out, or straighten me out, you'll come away with the truth of the matter. As you probably know, the first thinking about creating a Department of Transportation came in the post-revolutionary era with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson at various times giving thought to the process. It sort of languished until after World War II, the post-war Hoover Commission, in its report, indicated that serious study should be given to the thought of creating a Department of Transportation. The basic concept for a department is, of course, that transportation in all of its aspects constitutes, in effect, a system, and that the problems that can be most effectively dealt with are those problems of the nodes, the interfaces between the different modes. And that essentially, with a lot of shorthand, was the reason for trying to create the Department of Transportation. At a time in the mid-1960s, it seemed propitious to do that for a whole variety of reasons, a lot of which had to do with the technology in the field of transportation and aviation, railroading, and so forth, highways. And President Johnson created a group to study the matter and come up with a concept and an organizational approach for an organic act to create a Department of Transportation. This cadre of people was made up of folks like Langern and Cecil Mackey, and the people from the various agencies and departments which would be involved in the transfer into the department if it were to come about. And these people worked with great diligence and with a lot of thought, because at the same time they were considering the creation of a Department of Transportation. The same sort of events, the changes in culture as well as technology and economics, led them to the conclusion that there should be a companion, which was for a, I should say, substantial, if not massive, amount of deregulation. And in fact, both the creation of the Organic Act and the provision for deregulation were presented to the administration, and it was decided at that time, for strategic reasons, that to follow the sage advice of an old mentor of mine, you never should raise more snakes than you can kill in a day. It was rapidly apparent that just trying to get the department through with some vestige of what we had hoped would be accomplished was going to be all the snakes we could kill in a day. And I just say in passing that it took several years for the deregulation to get on the books, but it was not a new idea when it became a fact, and it was a good idea at the time we started it. There were a number of interesting things about the proposed Organic Act, one of which was that it would be the responsibility of the department to assess the cost-benefit ratios of all transportation projects which were proposed to be appropriated for. This touched the hearts of a number of people, particularly those involved in navigation, improvement of the inland waterways for navigation purposes. And the chairman of the Senate Committee on Organization was a gentleman named Senator McClellan from Arkansas, which happened to have a big river running along its borders that had some major improvement projects. And Senator McClellan was a man who was very perceptive. I gave him a draft copy of the proposal, and he was leafing through it, and he got to section 7, and he read it, and he said, "Allen, that dog won't hunt." And he was sure enough right, because he killed that dog, and it didn't hunt at all. Another aspect of the department, which of the law, which I thought was and is quite important, was section 4F, and that was the environmental section, which required consideration of the impact of transportation projects on the environment, the society and the economy and so forth. And that was the first time there was a broad piece of legislation in the U.S. government on the protecting the environment, or even looking at the environment. There were bits and pieces of laws in other acts, but nothing of that broad scale. And that caused a lot of heartburn among a lot of people, but I think it has proved to be a very satisfactory piece of legislation. We started the department with a group of people, many of whom had come from the other agencies that became a part of it. And we started with a new approach to safety, the creation of the National Transportation Safety Board, which really grew out of the Accident Investigation Bureau at the Civil Aeronautics Board, whose purpose had been to investigate accidents, to establish probable cause, and to make recommendations for improving safety. The National Transportation Safety Board was created as an independent agency with administrative ties to the department, and it was to cover all modes of transportation. My sense 40 years on is that the NTSB has been a wonderful organization that has operated with sterling quality throughout the years and has provided an enormous impetus for safety in the transportation world. The last thing I want to say is that the people who started the Department of Transportation were very smart, very bright people, as you will find out if you don't know Langen and Cecil already, who are great representatives of that cadre. People who were idealistic, who believed that transportation of goods and people was very important and could be a very important economic and social part of the United States of America, as well as providing for the security of the country, and who also were realists about what they could accomplish and how fast it could be done. And I would say that in closing that I was extremely proud of everybody who was in the Department of Transportation at the time I was there, and felt very honored to be associated with those people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. Now you've heard from the first Secretary of Transportation. I think the fourth Secretary of Transportation would like to get up and offer some preliminary remarks before we begin a give and take.
Well, thank you very much, and I really feel happy to be here. I think I could spend all my allotted time by saying, Alan, you really took over a tremendous task, and you did it very well, and I think every secretary since you would say that you were the one that made the difference. I think that you ought to have said that when you first put the proposal to the Congress, it was only about 69,000 people. And the Congress said that's not enough, and the Congressman said it has to be 100. At which point there was a wonderful memorandum that went to every agency in which said which entity of the federal government is only about 35,000 people, one area. And the poor Coast Guard realized, and that's how we got the Coast Guard. I hope we'll get it back someday. It's great because, as Alan said, that everyone in the Department of Transportation owes it all to Alexander Hamilton, because he was the one in that wonderful essay he wrote on the state of manufacturing in 1789, suggested that if this country was going to be a great country, it needed a method of communication, a method of traveling. And that was, in my judgment, the start of it. I think another hallmark of the department is that from the very beginning, it had a good workmanship with the Congress. And they worked with them, understood their issues, and they worked quite well together. And that's why I appreciate that Chairman Oberstar is to be here. I think it's quite relevant that two of the secretaries, not only came out of the Congress, but came out of the organization in the Congress that really supervised a lot of the Department of Transportation. Now, the person that talked about me first, with all due respect, made one mistake. I am not the second person of color ever to be head of this department. I'm the third. The first one, believe it or not, was Alexander Hamilton. He had at least 1/16 black blood in him, and I wish you would read it, and I always felt that that was very distinctive, that a person who either Jefferson or Hamilton or the two in the first cabinet, people say were the best, that one of the two happened to be a person of color. I say that because I think that one of the greatest thing about this country is the difference that has changed. And this was going to be a little later in my remarks, but I'm going to say it now. I'd like to share an experience with you. About a year ago, some organization had a celebration honoring the Department of Transportation. And the speaker was Colin Powell. And of course, being a military man, he pointed out that the highway department is highway and defense and what it did. But he then stepped back and for a moment and said, I'd like to say something which is very, very personal. I was born in New York, but I married a young lady from the South, got married, and then I went off to service. That obviously I would like to see my parents in New York and also see my wife and her parents in Georgia. But yet, whenever we traveled, particularly when we had children coming back from Vietnam and other things, I realized that from the moment I got to the Mason-Dixie line to the moment I got to the home in Georgia of my wife, there were very few places I could eat, no place I could sleep. And he then said, the people that made a difference was the Department of Transportation, because as they began to build these great highways throughout the country, and people had these shopping centers and everything, the Woolworths and those that served the South knew that if they didn't start accepting people of color, that those in the North would not boycott them. Now, believe it or not, you can talk about environment, you can talk about other things, but to me, that's one of the great attributes of this department, and you really sometime should talk about it. Next, when I took office, there was not much of a metro, and yet we were able to develop in such a way, and the one hallmark of this department is always had good general counsels, and we were somehow able to convince them that the money, which was really not supposed to go for building metro in the city, could do it. And we also developed a wonderful lady named Carmen Turner, who was a great asset. Another interesting experience I had was with respect to building that highway out in Colorado. And you had to go across the Colorado River. And I always thought that the Colorado River was as wide as Mississippi. But long after the highway was built, I got a chance to go out there, and part of the Colorado River is not as wide as this room. So I just urge all of you scholars and people that sometime go out and visit the property before you make these decisions. Finally, the charge of all of us as public servants, as citizens, is what vision do we have now so that by 50 years from now we have served the public well? Clearly, we have to be able to build trains that move faster. Clearly, we have to solve the problems that we have with respect to highways. Clearly, we have to make sure that automobiles are safer and they are more environmentally sound. Those are the problems, and that's the reason why I think the Department of Policy is so important. So all I can say to you, thanks very much. I enjoyed every minute of it, and if any president ever wants somebody else to be a secretary, give me a call, I'll come back.
Thank you, Secretary Coleman. The first Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Department of Transportation, obviously somebody near and dear to my heart, would like to offer some anecdotal observations of his own. So, Cecil, would you please come to the podium?
Thank you, Jeff. I think most of us know that there is oftentimes a little difference in perspective between the Secretary and virtually everybody else in the organization. Things affect you somewhat differently as a staff member or even as a line operating officer, and they look a little different through your eyes than they do through the Secretary's. I'd like to comment on just a couple of things that may not be in all the history books. Mr. Boyd indicated something of the creation of a committee to examine and propose a legislative program for President Johnson. What happened is, as I recall it, is that Mr. Boyd came back from the White House one day, and he said he would debrief a couple of us when he came back. This was when he was still in Commerce, and he said, President Johnson has created a task force. He's appointed me the chairman, and here are the members. you are now the executive secretary, draft our final report, and then we'll call a meeting of the group. And it proceeded on those terms. With regard to the proposals that came out of that group, it was in fact both a proposal to create a department and a proposal that was a comprehensive regulatory proposal. There were several of us with the legal background who were concerned with the regulatory process. And so we took that occasion to develop what we thought was a program in the public interest. When that went to the White House, it was approved, and it came back that both elements, both the creation of a department and a comprehensive deregulation program, were approved by the president. And it wasn't too long after that that the White House staff with the president had mulled it over, and the call came and they said, we think we will wait until the next term for the deregulation, though we have approved it and we like it, but if we create the department now, we'll have more leverage on the people we need to get support for the deregulation program. The next term didn't occur as the thinking had anticipated at that point, and so the deregulation had to wait till what seemed at the time sort of an unusual stimulus for it, and that was the anti-inflation program under President Ford. It reemerged, but it was, I can't say exactly the same, it was strongly reminiscent of the program that President Johnson had approved, and when it was identified as something to help curb inflation, it sort of got wide acceptance and went through much more easily than it might have otherwise. But it had been in the thought processes before, and those of us who had been associated with it were glad to see it enacted. One thing that was left out was a set of proposals that would have provided what we described as a kind of a public interest check on some of the deregulatory steps so that people would be bound to either adhere to them long enough for the public interest justification to be realized or several other things like that. And those restraints were not a part of the program when it was finally proposed to Congress. Two other things about the department that I think are worth noting for the record. One is that the department in its original creation was incredibly bipartisan. President Johnson often said when there were discussions about finding people, he said, find the best people, find good people. I'm not worried about whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And in fact, we had as an undersecretary a person who had been head of the Texas, he'd been head of Democrats for Eisenhower. We had an assistant secretary for technology who was a Republican. We had a first general counsel who was a Republican. We had a rail administrator who was a Republican. And there was simply no question. Partisanship was not an aspect. I don't know to what extent that has been continued under all the subsequent administrations. I would hope that as much of that as possible can be preserved any time for any of our cabinet level offices. The other thing is that one of the major considerations when the department was being proposed structurally was whether the assistant secretaries were going to be staff or whether they were going to be modally oriented. And that was a heated argument. Most of the industry in each of the segments wanted an assistant secretary for air, for highways, whatever. And they argued strongly for that at the White House. And the people who were working on this under Mr. Boyd in Commerce and argued against it and argued for the staff oversight and having staff positions to look at technology and international and policy. It was anything but a foregone conclusion, but that is the way that it finally evolved. And I hope that has served well because we tried to make the case for it as a preferred organization. It has lasted 40 years, so I guess it hasn't been too subversive an idea. The last incident I refer to for historical notation, when we were trying to get the proposal before Congress, Senator Magnuson was very helpful, and he and his staff wanted to be fed the information which would allow the bill to be put in the best form. And there was not the vast staff that may exist in some departments now. And one night, late working under a deadline, there were only 4 of us left at work about 11:15 in the 800 Independence Building. Mr. Boyd, I think Lowell Bridwell, who became the highway administrator, a young man who had worked with me named Scott Harvey, and I. And we were trying to put together the information for Senator Magnuson. Bridwell and I were finding the information. Scott Harvey was putting it together, and it turned out we had to have something typed to take up before midnight to get to the Capitol. And of the 4 people there, it turned out that Alan Boyd was the best typist. And so we fed him the information. He typed it, and when the time came for the signature line, we thought it would be only fair to recognize these talents. So at the bottom where you have the person who dictates the letter and the person who types it, we put SH for Scott Harvey and /ASB as the secretary for the letter, and sent it to the Hill just under the deadline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecil. Lot of food for thought there. We can talk more about some of the underlying principles, the idea of having not modal assistant secretaries, but functional. But before we get to the discussion that follows on these presentations, I'd like Langhorne Bond to offer some remarks as well. He, as I said, he served Alan Boyd first as an assistant over at the Department of Commerce when Alan was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Transportation, and then came to the department on the very first day to help Alan set it up as the equivalent of a chief of staff. Langhorne.
Speaking on behalf of all of the modal administrators throughout the years, I want to thank everyone who was responsible for not having us report directly to an assistant secretary. And there are those who really admire the National Transportation Safety Board, but those of us at the FAA who are responsible for doing things as opposed to generating airy-fairy advice to their betters, the Safety Board and the FAA duplicate their work a great deal. Let me put it that way. Okay. They seem to be experts on saying the obvious, it seems to me. But then I have a bias. This is the tension that makes the Department of Transportation the great institution that it is. When I was working for Alan, I rode a Honda Super Hawk motorcycle to work every day, and we'd go out of Hangar 6 in the FAA airplane. The FAA ran the hangar, and I used to pull it inside and park it. Well, they didn't like that, the guys that ran the hangar. They made me put my motorcycle outside. 8 years later, I came back as administrator of the FAA, and the people in Hangar 6 were in a condition of terror, thinking, what the hell is he going to do to us? Will we all go to Butte, you know? I forgave them for what they did to my motorcycle, but not obviously forgotten. One of the jobs that Alan gave me was to go around and assemble the trade associations when the DOT bill was put forward, and get them in line for supporting the DOT. And it was a bipartisan effort for sure. And I also wonder at Alan's wisdom, since I didn't know anything at the time. Okay, well, this was pretty big assignment for a kid. But anyway, I certainly learned as a result of that 2 things you might not know. One was that when we sent the bill forward to the Hill, it included the Maritime Administration. And it was controversial. Congressman Eddie Garmatz of Baltimore and the Marine lobby opposed that, and they had what was then called a teller's vote on the floor of the House. I watched it, and Garmatz won, took the Maritime Administration out of the department. Later, under Drew Lewis, it came in, but it was not there initially, which is a mistake. The other interesting thing was that as a result of the imposition by Bob Weaver, who was the HUD secretary under Johnson, the mass transit program, which was then in HUD, was not included in the department initially. And Alan gave me the job of lobbying the project on the Hill to get what became UMTA and now Federal Transit Administration into the department. We did that by means of a reorganization plan, not a statute, and it was a little easier to get that thing through. As I recall, in a room full of experts, that you really need 60 days, and if they don't reject it in a certain period of time, it automatically goes into play. But it was an administrative device that we took advantage of to get it together. So that's a little bit of history. If there is a disappointment for me, as Bill Coleman stated, it's the departure of the Coast Guard from the U.S. Department of Transportation. I thought, as we put it all together in the earliest days, and it was in the bill, that the engineers and technical types in the Coast Guard would just be a perfect place for the highway guys and the navigators over at the FAA and so on. This was really the right place for the Coast Guard. What do they have to do with the Treasury, for goodness sake? There was some foot dragging on this issue from the Treasury, and it quickly became apparent the reason. As these guys know, they would lose their secretarial mess, which was staffed by the stewards from the Coast Guard. And similarly, it seems to have departed from the department when the Coast Guard left as well. So with all of those heavy policy issues that I've laid out before you, I thank you for your time. I want to say that as a modal administrator, I feel like an intruder on this secretarial lineup here, but it's been a great ride. Thank you.
Cecil, I think that Langer's presentation evoked a thought that you wanted to share.
That story that Langer ended with is only halfway complete. There was another loss for the Coast Guard, and that was the administrative aircraft, which the Secretary of Commerce got to fly in. And when the proposal looked like it was going to move, Mr. Boyd, who was a great delegator, called me in one day and he said, look, you're responsible for some of this. You're suggesting that the Department of Commerce give up the Coast Guard. Treasury. Well, you go talk to the Secretary of Commerce and tell him why the Coast Guard should be in DOT. And so he had made an appointment with John Connor for me to have that conversation before he told me to go talk to him. And so I got that assignment. Mr. Connor was a very understanding man, and he decided he would not object to the change to have the Coast Guard go into DOT. But it was not an easy decision for him as a secretary there. He lost the airplane.
Newspaper readers will have seen a report just in the past few days. Former Secretary Mineta just made a proposal that all agencies with any maritime responsibility whatsoever be folded into the Department of Transportation, and that the Maritime Administration be enlarged as a federal maritime administration incorporating elements of the Corps of Engineers, the Federal Maritime Commission, perhaps, other elements of the government. We'll see if that gets traction. The acquisition of the Maritime Administration, I think it's worth noting, is the reason, or at least one big reason, why the original red triskelion, which many of you are still familiar with, was turned into a blue triskelion. The blue triskelion, for those of you who don't realize it, it represents 3 drops of water chasing each other in a circle. The Coast Guard apparently wasn't enough water to suggest that to the original designers, but by the time MARAD came, somebody thought we should turn it from red to blue. I was thinking long and hard about whether or not I should throw any pictures up on the screen, because they would be inherently embarrassing to anybody who's in them if they were pictures that came from that era. But there is one that I decided I would put up. Anil, can you throw that on the screen? This is, we talk about the Department of Transportation being a happy place in those days. You would not know it by the bunch of sourpusses that's sitting in front of you. Let me walk over there and tell you who they are, at least the relevant ones. First of all, that is John Robson. John Robson was the first general counsel of the department, and to Cecil's point, a Republican in a Democratic administration. I want to acknowledge Peter Craig. Peter Craig is sitting in the front row to your very far right as you look at the picture. He is the man who first hired me as a trial attorney in the Department of Transportation, starting a long and various hiccup career. Very long is the main thing, at the Department of Transportation. Peter, would you stand up and show everybody what you look like today? This gentleman. That's Carl Green. Carl Green was the lawyer in the Office of the General Counsel who represented just about everything that the Department of Transportation was doing on the international front back in those days. He went frequently to the Department of State, kibitzed at the table, trying to get some points made. Very early days for the department's involvement in international transportation activities. Carl, would you like to stand up? There's one other face in that picture which you will not recognize. I will not tell you who that is, and you will not be able to figure it out. Alan, you talked about Section 4F as being one of the pioneering provisions in the U.S. Code on the environment. You may or may not recall, but you did something very important with Section 4F. We had brought all of the elements of the transportation community and the federal government together under one roof, or at least most of them. You reserved any issue that implicated Section 4F to yourself. Any issue involving Section 4F was to be explicitly decided by the Secretary of Transportation personally. Do you recall the implications of that reservation, and would you like to comment on it?
Well, it gave me a chance to meet a lot of angry people. We had a few heated issues while I was there, and I'm sure while Bill was in office. I started off with the pleasure of Overton Park in Memphis, which the highway people were bound and determined to drive a highway through, and the people of Memphis were bound and determined not to have it happen. And then we had, I think it was called Confederate Park in San Antonio, the same sort of thing. And lurking over the horizon was something called the Three Sisters Bridge and I-66. So it was just something to keep the secretary from becoming bored with the mundane operations of the department.
May I add to that? That opinion was written by Mr. Justice Thurgood Marshall. And oftentimes thereafter, he'd come to my house and I'd have all these environmental impact statements, and I'd complain to him. He said, I never thought you had to do all that work. I just thought you would read it once or have somebody else read and get a memo. But as you know, when I came in office, we had the I-66, and I thought the way out of the box was to hold public hearings. And they pretty much worked for that. And I do think, Alan, that it did make a difference, and I think that you usually got the right result. and I think environment is important. But just like to tell you that Mr. Justice Marshall, when he wrote that opinion, never thought he was putting you to all that work out.
Jeff, Bill Coleman's not getting enough discussion here in this meeting. So as an aviation guy, I'd like to tell you the story about Concorde. Okay? Concorde was about to come into the United States, make a huge amount of noise, sport, pollution. Every enviro in the whole country was opposed to it, and the decision laid on Bill Coleman's desk. When it came time to make the decision towards the end of the Ford administration, Bill had, I guess, Don Bliss write 2 opinions, one admitting it and one not, and nobody knew what the answer was going to be. Then he held a press conference, and he had Coast Guards with guns on their hips guard the door so that none of these pesky reporters could get out first. And then he called Jerry Ford up on the telephone and told him he was going to let it in. And then he read this. This is one of the great secretarial gestures of all history. And I see some people back here who remember that great day.
Many of us will remember when the United States Congress, I think through the House of Representatives, voted down the $700 million appropriation that was then pending for the U.S. SST. I think that happened in 1971, 72.
It was the Senate, Jeff.
It was voted down in the Senate? Thank
It
you.
was the Senate, and I won a bet on it.
No bet for me. It was the Senate. But a lot of people, that was of course predicated entirely on the notion that 500 SSTs, when we got them all built, would then completely consume the ozone layer and the climate would fry. I mean, the Earth, the planet would fry. So it was voted down. We know what the Europeans did. They built the Concorde, and what was the maximum number that ever got built? By
19.
19.
That's your company.
That was Airbus Industries.
No, it was a predecessor. There was no Airbus industry then.
It wasn't, okay.
There was Sud Aviation and British Aerospace.
The ozone layer survived, near as we can tell. There are other challenges to it, but it certainly wasn't supersonic transport that brought us to the current concern about global climate change. So a lot of people think that decision actually was one of the turning points in terms of U.S. leadership in technology. The first time the United States Congress ever decided explicitly that the United States would not be first in one area of technology that we had been leaders in. I saw, as the then environmental lawyer, there was one in the department, that was me for a while, the environmental impact statement that was produced immediately after the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, which called for EISs. The environmental impact statement produced by the FAA on the SST project. It was half a page long. I'm not making this up. And it found that there would be no significant impact on the quality of the environment. Even then, knowing what I knew then, I sent it back for more work. We still got sued and lost, as far as I
You
know.
were right, because I asked the Secretary of Defense, I said, do you ever have any supersonic airplanes over the States? And he wouldn't tell me. I said, but there are at least 3 a day out there. He said, yes. So I figured that ended that part of the argument.
Let's take up this issue of regulation and deregulation. There was an awful lot of transportation policy being made at the time the department was created in agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, like the Federal Maritime Commission, and of course the Civil Aeronautics Board. How, in fact, would the Department of Transportation get its arms around the policymaking process? How would it live up to the challenge of the Department of Transportation Act to demonstrate leadership in forging transportation policy for the country when so much policy was being made in these independent regulatory agencies? Who would like to address the thinking at that time?
Cecil stated very accurately earlier that I'm a great delegator, and I know his name, Cecil.
Jeff, the prospect was really incorporated in the idea that the department would intervene in regulatory proceedings in a way that no entity of the federal government had either done or had been given an assignment to do previously. And so that became one of the principal assignments for the General Counsel's office. At the time, there was a man whose name was Donald Turner, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust. And his job and mine and the General Counsel's who were involved, it just turned out that Don Turner had been the teacher of the antitrust seminar at Harvard that I took as a graduate student there. So we were able to talk to one another fairly well. We had a somewhat different version of the public interest in some of the regulatory matters, but it was then that the process for having the policy office and the general counsel's office make recommendations to the secretary as to when the department would intervene on behalf of the government. And in a sense, that related to one other thing that was an interesting characteristic of the creation of the department. Mr. Boyd made the proposal to the president that the secretary be not only the Secretary of Transportation, but that he be designated as the special advisor to the president for transportation, which would give him an automatic right to be informed of and involved in matters that lay outside the immediate operational jurisdiction of the department. I don't know whether that carried over. I've not kept track. I think it was probably lost early after that. But that was an important concept when we were thinking about what to do, and it particularly applied to the regulatory matters, because without that, it would have been easy for people to say, well, what does DOT have as a charge? How does the secretary have any right to involve himself in this? But as a special advisor to the president on transportation, the entire field, even beyond what was in his own department, was his assignment on behalf of the administration and the government.
I'd like to add a couple of things there. One is on the first, on what Cecil was saying about special advisor to the president. The president told me he wanted me to be Secretary of Transportation, and I told him I would love to do it, but I had one condition, that he make no decisions on transportation without me being involved. And he said, absolutely, and he kept that 100%. He never let anything come through the White House about transportation that I wasn't in on. And I thought that was quite important for the department, not for me as a person, but for the department, because if you're trying to deal with the whole system, then you got people who are working out at the side. And I know it'll come as a shock to you, but that is possible in Washington.
Alan, I'd like to tell you, I think you told me that before I got sworn in. But you didn't tell me the second part of the problem. How do you get in to see the president?
Well, that was...
Can I tell you how I did it?
No, tell me.
Well, Dick Cheney didn't get to work until 7:25 in the morning. But Ford got in at 7:10. So if I showed up at 7:10, I could get in. If I showed up at 25, I couldn't. So I'll beg all of you, if you're ever in the government, know what time the president gets in, as against the chief of staff of the president. You can get a lot done.
Let's see. But on another aspect of deregulation, which goes somewhat, it's different than the question you were raising. I had some experience in the regulatory background, and it was clear to me from my time at the Civil Aeronautics Board that there was really no basis for the Civil Aeronautics Board anymore, because I was convinced it was possible to generate the financing to start a new airline if one had some freedom to do so. The people who were members of the CAB along with me were really wonderful, dedicated public servants, and we had a statute where there was no way you could define the public convenience and necessity. We were making arbitrary decisions on who should get what routes because we had nothing else to go on. And we all tried to do what we thought was right, given knowledge and so forth and so on. And in the railroad industry was going to pot for a whole number of reasons, a large percentage of which I would attribute to management. But at the same time, they were being eaten up by non-regulated transportation and unable to deal with it. It was it was fascinating. It used to be a yearly sort of waltz when the harvest season would come in. The railroad people would get called up before the commerce committees of the House and the Senate and just ridden out of town on a rail because they didn't have enough freight cars to take care of the harvest without delays. The farmers would come in and say they couldn't get any freight cars. The wheat was being stacked up in the fields and going to rot and all that. And it was all the fault of the railroads. And the railroads had fixed tariffs which they couldn't change. And the trucks and the barges would haul the stuff for 20 cents a ton in the winter. And during the harvest season, it was $2.50 a ton. And there was just no way the railroads could compete. And I thought that deregulation made an awful lot of sense with a lot of safeguards, which we sort of didn't get.
We have some, I guess the point is continuing to be argued, of course, before the Surface Transportation Board and before the Congress. It's an issue that certainly hasn't gone away. Just one anecdote. Some of you may listen to C-SPAN radio on Saturday afternoon when they play tapes of Lyndon Johnson on the telephone. It's absolutely fascinating. He would pick up the phone and call assistant secretaries in his administration. He'd call anybody. And it was very clear that he knew Alan Boyd very well. In 1965, I heard him talking in 1965 on the telephone to Carl Albert, the Speaker of the House. And at one point in the conversation, they got into grousing about the fact, the Speaker was grousing about the fact that he had enormous difficulty flying back home to Oklahoma. And the President said, "What do you mean? You mean you don't have a flight?" Meaning nobody was flying nonstop between Washington, D.C. and Oklahoma City or wherever he was flying to. He said, "No, it's tough. You got to go through Chicago and do all these other things." He said, "Well, why don't we just call Alan Boyd?" The President said, who was chairman of the CAB and who could make a flight happen. I guess that was the theory of how regulation worked in those days. Wouldn't it be great? Did you ever do anything for Carl Albert, Alan?
I always spoke highly of him.
We have a roving
Now
microphone
that
and an awful lot of people who
Pardon me,
probably...
sir. Now
Oh,
that you're
excuse
talking
me,
about
Secretary
railroads,
Coleman.
I think it's time to talk about one of my failures, but also give a subsequent secretary, namely Senator Dole, credit. One, I tried like heck to change Union Station. I could never fix it up, but then she came in and she did that. But secondly, when I became secretary, as you know, the Penn Central and the Reading and all the major railroads was in bankruptcy. And I got in it pretty late. By that time, they'd set up something called, I think, USERA, and they made the deal they were going to create Conrail. And I said that didn't make sense, but I knew the guy that was running USERA would expect to be head of Conrail. And it's kind of hard to persuade a person. And I really should have done, which I didn't do, was to sell half of it to the Chesley and half of it to the Southern. But about 10, 15 years later, that's what Senator Dole did, and as a result of which the government, if they'd done it earlier, would have saved about $10 or $15 billion. So I really think, even though Senator Dole is not here right now, that you ought to give her credit for having the vision to bring about that change.
Thanks. A lot of alums in the audience, and I just, before we close this first panel, I just wondered if there were any comments on any of the war stories and anecdotes we've just been hearing. Anybody have a hand? I have just one comment, and we'll then come over to Alan Pizarski. Suhail, do you want to bring the microphone around? On the notion that Cecil was talking about of intervening in regulatory proceedings, that was Peter Craig's job. I think it was Alan Pizarski right there. Peter Craig was in charge of the office. I was one of the attorneys in the office, and Cecil, you're right. I mean, there was real confusion. We'd go into those hearings, And of course, there was always public counsel. That is, the CAB had an office that was supposed to represent the public interest. The ICC had an office representing the public interest. So in waltzes the Department of Transportation, and somebody says, because you've got to have standing to show up in these places, so who do you represent? We said, oh, we represent the public interest. Well, if you can imagine the specter of two civil servants having a tug of war over who really represents the public interest, you can see that there were some growing pains in the early days of the Department of Transportation. Alan, please.
First, a quick comment. Charlie Baker couldn't be here today, and I know he wanted to ask this question. When we first moved into 407th Street, we were walking through the debris, and we got to the offices of the Assistant Secretary for Policy, and someone who is now gone had picked out all the furniture in the bipartisan spirit, and we walked in, there was chartreuse rugs and fuchsia sofas and chairs, and Charlie just stood there, you know, in tears, knowing that someone had played a small game on. I see Mr. Mackey smiling.
Any changes like that came after my time.
Oh, okay.
Paul Charrington may have brought those tapes from Boston. I don't know.
Right. Actually, I wanted to ask the secretaries, looking up to the present, what has been really different than what you expected to see in the department and in transportation? Mr. Secretary Boyd and Coleman.
Well, two of us, and he's the ranking secretary, so I take it that's directed towards him.
Well, I'll make a disclaimer first that in recent years I have been away from Washington and I haven't followed the ups and downs of the department. I share a view that has been stated earlier. I feel very sad about the Coast Guard having left. I thought I shared Cecil's view that the Coast Guard added, it was the potential for the Coast Guard as a part of the department was really, I thought, very, very substantial. I'm concerned that the department isn't making waves. I would have been happier if the department were, e.g., proposing bullet trains or proposing the various aspects of air transportation shifts or proposing different sorts of things that would deal with what I think is the increasing needs for transportation and increasing policy issues which are sort of colliding with transportation and the transportation infrastructure. And I have the feeling, and I apologize ahead of time that I don't know what I'm talking about, but my feeling is that the department has become passive, and to some degree,
Chairman.
and our approach was let's get out there and say something and do something and start some arguments and get some progress. That's my answer.
Chairman Oberstar has arrived. Ladies and gentlemen, this is probably a good time to take a very brief break, and we'll reassemble our second panel, including the chairman, to talk about intermodalism at the Department of Transportation.
How much time do you have?
You know, if I might be permitted to make a few remarks, we had a series of votes right at the time your program was starting, and they've now started on the next series, which is a continuing resolution in which you have only a passing interest here. And I know you've probably all been sitting for a very long time, but if I could just say a few things about this great Department of Transportation, and then await the call of the House, which is likely to come as
Okay, well, then let me just give you a very brief introduction. I promise it'll be brief. Chairman Oberstar, following his graduation, taught English to Haitian military personnel, and French and Creole to members of the U.S. Marine Corps Military Advisory Group in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, from 1959 to 1963. That's because he earned a master's degree in European Studies at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, earlier. He served as Chief Staff Assistant to his predecessor in the Congress, Congressman John Blatnick, from 1963 to 1974, which is precisely why we wanted him so badly to be on this panel, because of course that period included the creation of the Department of Transportation. Jim Oberstar began representing Minnesota's 8th Congressional District in his own right in 1975. He's now in his 17th term, the longest service in the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Minnesota in history. Because of his long service to the transportation community over so many years, including his chairmanship of the House Subcommittee on Aviation, he's widely known among his colleagues in Congress as Mr. Transportation. May I introduce the chairman of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Jim Oberstar.
Well, thank you very much, and and my apologies again to the schedule for the intervening votes of the House, as we quaintly say in legislative language. But I so wanted to be here. I see all sorts of good. I don't say old friends anymore. I say friends of long standing. You get on in years, but listen, I'm just happy to be anywhere after the operation I went through to realign my neck and put titanium rods and screws and correct a bicycling accident of 20 years ago. But I'm back, and I have less tolerance for nonsense and falderall than I did before. But I especially wanted to be here for this very significant moment of tribute to 40th anniversary of the Department of Transportation. Transportation has been a fundamental of our nation from its very origins. In 1789, in the first Congress, the Committee on Rivers and Harbors, which is the immediate predecessor committee of the Transportation, it was called Committee on Public Works for many years, but it's Transportation and Infrastructure now. The very first act of the very first Congress in 1789 was that of the Committee on Rivers and Harbors to establish and maintain a lighthouse at Hampton Roads. And the second act of the first Congress was to establish and maintain a lighthouse at the entrance to Chesapeake Bay at Cape Henry. And in the earliest days of the nation, it was the interest of the federal government to develop a revenue stream. And the Lighthouse Act of 1789, which followed on those two initial pieces of legislation, created a revenue source through the collection of duties to pay for the maintenance, establishment, and operation of the first two and all subsequent lighthouses. And from that very beginning, the public sector has been critically engaged in transportation, building our new nation. Our first president, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both proposed and advocated the development of westward transportation, an trans-Appalachian road to connect the settled East Coast and developing East Coast to the interior of this new nation. They thought that crossing the Appalachians would be a way to reach out to and link the newly establishing Western settlements with the East Coast and its trade in the international arena. That was eventually authorized in 1806 as the National Road, and that became National Route 40 over time, and was signed into law by President Jefferson. A long established history that was further stimulated by Albert Gallatin, the first Secretary of Treasury, or not the first, but one of the first Secretaries of Treasury, who conducted a long study, and they didn't have a whole huge staff in those days. Those secretaries did stuff themselves. And he was directly engaged in and produced a report called the Report on the Subject of Public Roads and Canals in 1808. That formed the foundation for a long debate and discussion, but unfortunately, the Congress didn't act upon Gallatin's wisdom. Congress dragged its feet, wasted a great deal of time in debate. There was a very important debate in 1848 when the President, Polk, proposed a tonnage tax upon canals. And a first-term member of Congress rose in the House to say, the tonnage tax will stifle the initiative upon which we are about to embark. You first must dig the canal so that you will have the tonnage in it upon which to impose a tax. That member of Congress was Abraham Lincoln, who opposed tonnage taxes. We could use him today. The next major initiative that came on the heels of the Gallatin report was, but not stimulated by it, was in 1894, when a group of bicyclists were upset with the newfangled horseless carriages using their bicycle trails, creating ruts and causing headers or face plants, as they were called in those days, wanted to get them off the bike trails, and they got up a petition of 150,000 names, rolled it on one of those great big wheels, you see with power cable, and they wheeled it into the House of Representatives and asked for a grant of $10,000 to study a system of roads for the horseless carriages. The Congress appropriated the funds. The study was completed, resulted in establishing of the Bureau of Road Inquiry in 1896 in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That was followed by creation of the Bureau of Public Roads in 1912. And from 1912, it took 65 years for Americans to drive the first 1 trillion miles on American roadways. But then it took only 20 years to drive the next 2 trillion miles a year, and then less than 10 years for 3 trillion miles. And we were off and running. Well, in 49, the first Hoover Commission report suggested and recommended coordination of transportation activities that were scattered in various bureaus and agencies and entities of the federal government. And President Truman responded by creating the Office of Undersecretary for Transportation in the Department of Commerce. A further study headed by George Hilton and the Bureau of the Budget under then Gordon Murray, who had the opportunity to meet, advised President Johnson to create a Department of Transportation. We're the only industrialized nation in the world that didn't have a Department of Transportation. And Johnson responded. But he did it in a very unique way. Now, just remember the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It was done helter-skelter. Johnson sent his staff up to the Hill. Now, I was chief of staff, as Jeff said, for my predecessor, John Blotnick, who chaired the subcommittee on executive and legislative reorganization, to meet with us and with Warren Magnuson's staff over in the Senate and ask, how do we put this together? What are your ideas? How should we do this? So Elmer Henderson was our chief counsel of the subcommittee. He was also an associate professor of law at Howard University. And we sketched out how this would be done. And then they got Senate ideas. And then Johnson put this notion in his State of the Union message. and then set up the legislative proposal that we had pre-crafted. We held hearings in March. The Senate followed hearings in April. We worked from the end of April through May, June, all the way through summer, worked out the threading together of 36 entities into a Department of Transportation, and by September, had it all worked out. But the White House was there with us every step of the way, working with both the House and the Senate, and the House and Senate staff were working together to craft this thing, totally unlike the way the Department of Homeland Security was created. That was sort of helter-skelter. And we moved the bill in early October. The President signed the Department of Transportation Act into Public Law 89-670 on October 15 and called it the most important transportation legislation of our lifetime, one of the essential building blocks in our preparation for the future. And on April 1, 1967, the new cabinet level was created, Department of Transportation, fulfilling Gallatin's dream, and Alan Boyd had the great good fortune to be its first secretary. And he did a superb job, terrific job. And from there, we moved on to intermodalism, a subject that is going to be considered in your next panel. But I've just gotten a signal from my chief of staff that the votes have been called in the House, and so I'm going to have to run. But this is a great opportunity to look back, reflect on how far we've come, how much we have yet to do, and how essential this Department of Transportation is. That vision of creating a Department of Transportation to establish the mobility and the economic vitality of this country that revolves around transportation. Okay, that's the second call. Thank you. I've got to run.
Another great secretary. Great assistant secretary. Don't forget us model administrators.
Modal and, yeah. Well, I was planning to stay and talk about modalism and intermodalism, but I'm sorry, I have to run and vote.
Well, modalism and intermodalism will be, in fact, the subject of the next conversation. And so what I'd like to do is bring this panel to a close with great thanks to this very distinguished group, and then bring up panel number 2. But thank you very much for your contributions to this program. We've been talking, and the Chairman Oberstar's remarks couldn't be a better segue, frankly, into the subject of the next panel, which is to take a look back and a look forward at the Department's ability to draw the diverse threads of transportation together in something like a coherent program. That was what was envisioned by the Congress and the Department of Transportation Act, despite the fact that we do have modal administrations. And we do have different committees of Congress organized around different modes. It makes it a little bit difficult to realize the promise of the Department of Transportation Act, but we nevertheless continue to aspire toward a more intermodal approach to transportation at the federal level. So we have assembled another distinguished panel for you, and I will introduce them now. First, on your left is Kate Sigerud, who is a director in the Physical Infrastructure Team for the Government Accountability Office. She directs GAO studies on a variety of transportation issues, but the reason she is here most importantly is because she directed a study of intermodal transportation, which was put out just last June. And it says, DOT could take further actions to address intermodal barriers. It says that right there. And if you haven't seen a copy of this report, just go to the GAO website, gao.gov. Put in the word intermodal, and it will pop up, and you can simply print it right out. So thank you for being here, Kate. Next is Mort Downey. Mort, a Yale graduate, served in the Carter administration as Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs, After that, he became Executive Director and Chief Financial Officer at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City and helped oversee the turnaround of the country's largest independent transportation authority. And then he became Deputy Secretary of Transportation under all 8 years of the Clinton administration, a world record for that position. When he left, DOT retired his jersey, and you'll see it hanging in the atrium just outside. He's now president of PB Consult, the transportation consulting group of renown, and also has a very long list of other public policy accomplishments that I won't take time now to list. Rob Martinez is next. Rob came to the Department of Transportation as the Assistant Maritime Administrator in 1990. In 1992, after the passage of Ice-T, Secretary Skinner made him the Associate Deputy Secretary. That was a position that existed, but he combined that position with making him the first director of the brand new Office of Intermodalism. Rob, after the end of Bush 41, that came before those of us in that administration had hoped, he landed on his feet and became the Secretary of Transportation of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He joined Norfolk Southern in 1998, where he now serves as Vice President for Business Development. Last but not least, Paul Brubaker. Paul is currently the administrator of one of our newest administrations. Notice I didn't call it a modal administration. It is called the Research and Innovative Technology Administration. It is, more than any other element of the Department of Transportation, an intermodal administration. Before he came to the department, he was CEO at Procentrix, a firm that helps organizations plan and manage and achieve performance goals using technology. Prior to that, he served as Executive VP and Chief Marketing Officer of SI International, one of the nation's fastest growing government contractors. He had some high positions at the Department of Defense before that and had a long career in the private sector prior to going to defense. And Paul is going to talk to us about his vision for the intermodal imperative going forward. But before we get into the rest of the panel, I was hoping that Kate could summarize for us, just as a starting point for the conversation, what she found in the study that was published last June. So Kate, would you like to come up?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me over to this event. I have to say that as a GAO employee, and I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure or the opportunity here at the department of working with GAO, that we're sort of shy, retiring analyst type. So being invited to be the warm-up act for a holiday party is a new experience for me. I hope I can live up to your expectations. It was really great to see Chairman Oberstar here. I wish he could have stayed with us a few minutes longer. Of course, his committee has been the source of much of the work that GAO has done, looking cross-modally or intermodally at the department. Of course, in the House, the committee does handle the entire department, unlike the Senate, where we report to many different masters, shall I say. As various administrations have made changes to the way the department is organized, and Congress has also made new laws requiring the department to do its business differently, there's been lots of work for the government, the General Accounting Office, now the Government Accountability Office, to do. Some of that has required us to look very specifically at the organization of the department, including how cross-modal or intermodal issues are handled. Let me just mention a few things we've done recently and are doing now. We've looked several times at the organization of research within the department, for example. And of course, we know there is recent congressional action with regard to the setting up of the RITA organization as a new take on research in the department. We spend a lot of time looking at safety. Let me just mention right now, we're looking at implementation of the various new highway safety concepts that were in Safety Lou. For example, how states are putting together their strategic highway safety plans. That, of course, requires them to work with NHTSA, FHWA, and FMCSA to get those accomplished. But I think it's our work on DOT's grants for surface transportation programs and the extent to which they can, in fact, support high-quality projects that are important for improving mobility that is the focus that generated this invitation today. And in GAO, we've really looked at intermodalism from two different perspectives. One being sort of under current law and policy, can grant recipients make decisions to solve their mobility problems in ways that focused on the best mode and approach? And do they have the tools and the means to do that from the federal programs that provide these funds? And the second concept is how can projects that do in fact facilitate intermodal movements of passengers and goods be accommodated under current federal transportation policy? And I'm going to focus on that second question at Jeff's request today. There are two reports you might want to take a look at. I was planning to talk about the first one. In the interest of time, I'll skip it and just say that it concerns intermodal facilities at airports, so passenger movement in airports. Members of Congress travel frequently to Europe and look with envy on the ability of people to move in and out into regional, local, and national train systems, for example, from those airports, the ease with which they can purchase tickets and move luggage, et cetera, and how that all seems to work so much better than it does with, except for a few isolated examples in the United States. We spent a lot of time looking at that. There's a 2005 report that I'm glad to point you to. I think if you search intermodal, you'll find that one too. But I'd like to move on then to the study the committee asked us to do that was published in June. And what the committee asked us to do, and this is Chairman Oberstar's committee, was answer three questions. What barriers inhibit development of intermodal projects using federal funds? Second, what is DOT and the Office of Intermodalism doing to address these barriers? And do they support the vision of intermodal transportation laid out in ICE-T? And third, essentially, what else could DOT be doing? The look back to ICE-T, I think, was important. Here, the Congress has spoken clearly and recently in support of the intermodal concept. And it even took pains to define an intermodal system and what it meant. And it gave DOT a few tools. Let's just mention a few of those. Some flexibility to move funds between highway and transit projects and accounts within the department. We did issue a report on that in July, if anyone's interested. It established new planning requirements for integrated transportation systems and called for a statewide intermodal planning process. It created the Office of Intermodalism within this department. It created a National Commission on Intermodalism, and it required states to develop the infamous management systems, including one for intermodal transportation facilities and systems. As I'm sure you're aware, this requirement was dropped several years later in the NHS Designation Act. Well, so what didn't it do? Those are all some great tools. What didn't it do? It didn't, at the heart of it, address the stovepipe funding systems to our different modes. And it didn't really establish much in the way of new requirements or provide resources for the Department of Transportation, states, or MPOs to use in adopting this intermodal concept. Subsequent service authorizations, of course, kept the ICE-T language and did little more than ICE-T, however, to provide the kind of specific enabling tools that would be useful for developing intermodal projects. With that background, let me just tell you how we answered the questions. So I mentioned what were the barriers. Well, we mentioned a couple, and the first one being limited funding. And we mean a couple different things by that. The fact that stovepiping complicates efforts to construct complex multimodal facilities if federal funds are in fact to be used. We did see a lot of these kinds of facilities being built throughout the United States, but the work with the federal department is fairly complicated to tap the different funding streams that are necessary for those kind of projects. There are some flexible programs. I might mention TIFIA and CMAQ, among others, but they're relatively restrictive in how the dollars can be used. And finally, congressional earmarking of some of the programs that could be sources of funds. I would note in this case, particularly some of the corridor programs, really ties up a lot of the dollars and the flexibility at the local and state level. Another barrier was limited stakeholder collaboration within the department itself. We talked about the stovepiping in terms of control of funds. Also, there's many rather than one point of contact for local government, state government, or other organization that wants to build an intermodal facility, and that complicates the work. And at the state and MPO level, projects like corridor projects with benefits that go beyond their borders are difficult to work through the planning process. Then there's the problem of data resources. Lack of data on costs and benefits of intermodal projects to inform that are not generally as available as they could be to inform state and local decision makers. Benefits often accrue beyond the region. It's hard to take care of that in the state and MPO context. And finally, freight data are often hard to come by from the private sector in doing the planning work. So we looked then at what had the Department of Transportation done to deal with all these issues? A fair amount, actually. In the funding area, we noticed a number of guidebooks, guidance available with regard to freight, service access at airports, and other key issues related to intermodal projects. With regard to collaboration concept, of course, Undersecretary Shane had created the Internal Intermodal Council in the department. By the time we issued our report last year, there had been a few meetings, but I'm anxious to hear Perhaps he can say some more about how that's going. And we noted, again, a lot of high-level cross-modal efforts on freight policy within the department as well. With regard to the data barrier, a fair amount of training and data actually available from the department, having to do with planning and project analysis, freight issues, databases that are useful for states and MPOs. And then finally, there was a safety law requirement to do a plan related to intermodalism. And again, our work was completed before that was finished, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to turn out, but it seems to be focused mainly in the freight area. There were one issue that Congress was particularly interested in was in the Office of Intermodalism. It's an office that Congressman Oberstar in particular is very fond of. He was not happy to see it in RITA rather than in the Office of the Secretary. But in our discussions with Jeff, it became clear that there are elements of that office that remain within his purview that have to do with intermodal projects, again, primarily in the freight area. We made a number of recommendations to the department having to do with, again, I think primarily providing information through websites, through training and guidance, through specifically making intermodalism a focus so that when a project sponsor comes to the department and would like some help navigating the various funding streams, how do we make that happen? We also noted that some of the very good activities going on with regard to freight were somewhat hard to find on the website and in guidance as well. We made those recommendations, and the department, I think, largely agreed with them. We may have had one continuing area of disagreement, and that had to do with the extent to which the concept of passenger intermodalism is, in fact, a prominent effort in the department. I think what Jeff would have said to us is that passenger intermodalism is worked through all of the passenger-related modes and has become a way of doing business. We saw a bit of a gap there, as did a lot of the states and metropolitan planning organizations that we spoke with, and continued then to make that recommendation. I'd be glad to take any questions when the time comes along, but I think in the interest of getting to the party, I'll wrap up and not get into more detail. Thanks.
Thank you. Hurtling right along, Mort Downey, would you like to come up and offer some thoughts from your vast experience in the department, 2 long presidential appointments?
Yes, thank you. And one other point I'd make about service in the department. When the Coast Guard was shipped over here on April 1st, 1967, along with the mess and the aircraft, I came as a Coast Guard reservist, and so my tenure in the department does go back to day one, and I don't think there's been another day since that either Jeff or I haven't been there. So, so we need to worry about a year from now where things will go. But I really haven't over that 40 years enjoyed very much working with all of you, working with the department. I'm still doing a little bit of work for the secretary, for which I had to sign a document called a gratuitous services contract. And it had an affidavit that said, and if you didn't believe the contract, believe this, you won't get paid. And I was home that day. I had to get my wife to witness it. She's convinced I'm crazy. Anyway, I think it's a very apt topic to talk about at the 40th anniversary of the department. If there are any good reasons for having a department, as we heard from Alan, intermodal transportation is right up there. Behind safety. Safety is always the #1 objective, but having a system that works is really critical, and having that view. All of these transportation functions either have before or still operate independently. Langhorne spoke for the independence of the modal administrators, and I agree with him on that. But somebody has to look at it as a system, recognize that as we think about research, as we think about planning and policies, we think about funding and project delivery, somebody is looking at the system. You could achieve this, as some have suggested, by reorganizing. I would not recommend that. Having been through a couple of efforts at reorganization, it is not a good use of time. I looked up last night at the report of the Intermodal Commission that Kate spoke to, and had a paragraph in there that said, reorganizing would be a good idea. However, it shouldn't happen in the middle of a secretarial term. And I believe that secretarial term's middle is defined as everything after taking the oath before turning over the keys. It won't happen. So we have to figure out how to make intermodalism work. And that'll happen with leadership. and it'll happen with focus on the outcomes that we want to see from the transportation system. And it'll take a lot of both leadership and focus to make that happen. It's an issue both in passenger and in freight. They're separate problems and opportunities with both. I think on the passenger side, we've come a fairly long way, because many of these things happen at the metropolitan, the local level. People want to pull things together. They want to work with the department to make it happen. Small things, big things. We've finally got a smart card that gets you around this region on every mode of transportation. We're seeing more and more airports that have connecting services to them. And if I can offer one small commercial, I'll give you an opportunity to work with us on a project in New York that will have Amtrak and airport access and several subway lines and 3 commuter railroads and a short walk to the ferries and to the bus terminal, and you can name it after the father of the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. So a deal you can't refuse. The freight side, very much more complex. It's public sector and it's private sector. It is much more nationally oriented than simply looking at local issues, and it still has a lot to be done. When I was with the Port Authority in the 60s and 70s up in New York, we used to talk about 2 things that had to happen for a good intermodal transportation system. One was what we then called, maybe some of you remember it, called trade facilitation. That was called making the paperwork catch up with the movement of the goods. The other was inventing the container system and making that work. But today, the facilitation side is essentially done. Information technology works that for us. We really have to work the other side, the physical facilities. So what are those prospects? What should we be asking the department to do to advance that cause? First off, we have to recognize that the kinds of projects that we need, they're complex, they're difficult to address. These are not the mass production models that roll off the assembly line of the federal highway programs, the formulas. They're all unique. They all have to be crafted. They're custom built, and we should work to make that happen. We should work with the particulars of a project, the particular modes of transportation and entities that are involved in it, the sources of revenue generation, and recognize all of them will take a long time. I wish Michael Huerta were here, and maybe we'll see him later. Ask him how much time went into the Alameda Corridor. It was a full-time, 724-a-day job to get that pulled together, but look where it is today. You just can't relate and expect these things to happen. You have to work hard to put them together. Well, looking ahead, there are things that we should be doing. There are concerns we should have. Kate has mentioned a couple of them. I think there still is in the minds of people who are out there working on these a little uncertainty as to exactly where the center of gravity about intermodalism is in the department. And we need to do that because there needs to be a place that can not just do research and study, but can actually make things happen. So we have to look at that. We have to look at the issue of decision making. How decisions are done. Earmarks were mentioned earlier. That's not a good thing in terms of these projects. Some things can masquerade as intermodal projects, but we really have to have a basis to say these work, these don't. But on the other side, I think there are some positives that we can build on. The work that Jeff has done in the freight policy framework, the great work that Federal Highway has done in the presentations of the framework of freight data. We have to make sure that we still put good data into the bottom of that system to make sure that these good displays come out. But it's allowing us to make decisions. We now have some financing techniques, private activity bonds, the TIFIA program, that really are tailor-made for the intermodal activities that have both the public and private sector. So if we all work hard at this, maybe the next anniversary of the department, the 50th, we can look back at many more successes in the intermodal world, and I look forward to being with you for that event.
Thanks, Bart. Terrific advice. And while I was looking the other way, Secretary Peters joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, and our Deputy Secretary, Admiral Tom Barrett. And I also want to recognize someone who came in just a little bit late, Jim Beggs, who was Deputy Secretary in the Nixon administration. Jim, as I think people remember, went on to be the NASA administrator and then run a small company called General Dynamics, I think, for a while, and just a superb career over many years. It's wonderful to see you again. So let's move on now to the very first director of the Office of Intermodalism, Rob Martinez. who was Associate Deputy Secretary in Bush 41 under Secretary Sam Skinner. Rob?
Thanks very much, Jeff. If anything sounds critical about DOT that I might say, I say it out of love. It has been, I mean that seriously, it has been a number of years since I've been here. But as many of you know, I continue to remain close to the organization and feel very strongly about it. How do you change a successful organization? That's really what we're about, and that's really what the agenda should be for intermodalism. I think really, after reading the GAO report, which we were all advised to do before coming onto this panel, it really, in my mind, where we are on the front of intermodalism is really sort of a tale of two cities. We have, on the one hand, a programmatic structure. If there were two criticisms of the very excellent work that was done by GAO in this report, they would be that really I think we are somewhat at a tale of two cities. On the one hand, we have a number of successes, including what is going on in the marketplace. Talking specifically, for example, on surface transportation in terms of the movement of freight. And in that regard, I think that the GAO study obviously was trying to respond to what Congress requested of it, but it's not capturing what's going on in the marketplace. And secondly, it would have been, I do believe, somewhat better had we also focused on the programmatic structures that we have today at the federal level, which are increasingly out of line, misaligned with what the necessity is outside this building. It's very difficult to pursue reorganizations when the programmatic structure dictates certain flow of funds in certain ways that dictate an organizational response, which I think is well reflected here at USDOT. But really, we need more reform to take place on the programmatic side, including up on the Hill in the way the programs are structured. Talking to the issue of surface transportation specifically, we have today what is a mature market. And the elements of how you address the problems faced in a mature market are different than the elements that the problems that we faced 40 years ago when the department was founded, 50 years ago when the Eisenhower legislation was enacted, for example, on the interstates. In an immature market, it's very easy to make an investment and for that investment to have a positive return. In a mature market, you have the issue of diminishing returns. And that means that what we should be focusing on really is how we make our investments. We need better investment decisions. This requires, on the public side, more flexibility in how we do public funding and how programs are structured. And secondly, it means more public-private, with the private sector funding being commingled, but basically assuming a financial risk on those projects that are funded. Government must become comfortable with the notion of profit. Profit is a great motivating factor, and profit will release huge amounts of investment that are currently not being released into the transportation marketplace. Profit is a good thing, but government also needs to understand that profit accrues in a public-private project to specific private entities, and that's where you all struggle. I understand it, but we've got to get over it as a matter of national policy. Our surface transportation projects need pricing mechanisms to calibrate supply and demand. That is missing largely today. And in the absence of having pricing mechanisms to calibrate demand versus supply, until we get there, we will not solve the issues of congestion and ultimately mobility. I think at the end of the day, if we were to be moving in these directions, we would create a more flexible and by its nature, a much more intermodal, multimodal dynamic into our programs. I am going to stop there because we don't have too much time. I will say one thing on this issue of public-private is that we need to recognize that every single public-private project is going to be different. there is no single model to how to bring about a successful public-private project. And in that regard, we need a programmatic structure and an organizational structure here that is flexible as well, so that we can address that as we move forward. Thank you all.
I know that the program said we would end not later than 2:30. The next formal part of the program is at 3 o'clock, when Secretary Peters will be recognizing former secretaries. So I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair and say we'll continue for about 15 more minutes. I'm very anxious to have Paul Brubaker, the RITA administrator, speak. So Paul, if you would come up, please.
Thanks a lot. I'll be brief. The one thing that wasn't mentioned in my background is I'm an ex-GAO person. So yeah, criteria, condition, cause, and effect, the elements of a finding, all that stuff. I don't want to become a finding. So just understand that I'm very cognizant of that. And I also spent some time on Capitol Hill. And many of you have heard the Secretary speak before, and she always speaks about safety system performance and 21st century solutions. So I want to dwell in on system performance here for a minute, because I think it's really critical to this discussion. Prior speaker Rob mentioned the funding and the issue of how we fund projects. But as we focus in on system performance, we really have to understand, and this is where RITA, I think, can really add a ton of value to the dialogue. We really need to understand in a measurable way the performance of the system. And if you look at the transportation system, yeah, I hear the criticism about being organized in a modal aspect, but we really are a system of systems. That performance data that we need in order to make informed decisions and really kind of change the paradigm by which we fund infrastructure projects is really intermodal by its very nature. And what we're doing in RITA is we're actually approaching the research investment that way. We're organizing something called, and the Deputy Secretary sat through a governance process meeting on this the other day, but we're organizing the way we approach research in a very intermodal, portfolio-focused type of way. Let me give you a specific example. And this process, we call it the RPIC process, which you might recognize from GAO. It's actually a variation of capital planning and investment control, but we're applying those same principles and those same best practices to research and the research investment. And I'll give you a specific example around research. We're going to treat the portfolio in communities of interest as opposed to specific modes. So one example is in the area of human factors. That as a department, we do a ton of human factors research. Every mode has some activity. RITA, through its 60 university transportation centers, we probably have a dozen of them that do human factors research. And each one of those activities has some commonality. And it's really important that we understand from a research planning and management perspective exactly what that commonality is and how can we get better visibility into that portfolio of human factors research. It's that way there are a number of communities of interest that we're setting up, and then there are subunits within that community of interest that are important to us, and we need to get real visibility into the activity there and really understand the contribution that that research makes to the department in furthering our system performance goals or our safety goals. And we're applying that towards research. The other thing we're doing is we're doing a little bit of reorganization. I'll give you another specific example. The Volpe National Transportation Center is about to be reorganized into centers of excellence. One of those centers of excellence is really zeroed in on logistics and supply chain management, system performance, and resilience. So what we want to understand is really from an empirical point of view, from a data-driven point of view, exactly how the movement of freight from an intermodal perspective occurs, and where are the weaknesses in that system, and where are, whether it's in rail or road or MARAD, we really want to understand the performance, and we want to measure that performance so that we can understand a couple of things. One, where do proposed projects impact the performance of the system? Secondly, we also want to know where do events impact the system, and what are the things that we can do proactively to mitigate the negative impact of either man-made events or natural events, like, for example, Hurricane Rita or a terrorist attack or a longshoreman strike. fill in the blank. But we really want to create a center of excellence with people who know and can coordinate research and can collect the data so that we are, in fact, making data-driven decisions. Ultimately, at some point, what would be great would be if we could use that kind of data to drive investment portfolios of projects, whether they're individual mode or part of a larger system of systems type approach, to measurably improving that system performance. And that's really the vision of RITA, and that's one of the things that we're really focused on achieving in the next 403 days, but who's counting? Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for talking fast. Take a deep breath. We appreciate it a lot. Just in the few minutes that we have left, let's talk about what we are doing to enhance the intermodal performance of the department. Kate pointed out that we did start an intermodal council. I have to say, in response to your question, that it is still a work in progress. It hasn't yet achieved the robust life in the department that I know Secretary Peters envisions for it and that I do. I think it's going to take a little more time before it gets legs. And I think that's partly because, number one, we probably pitched it at the wrong level. It's very difficult to get all of our administrators together in the same room at the same time on a regular basis. We probably need to do it at the policy level. It can be a notch down from the administrator level. And then we need to find an agenda that actually engages the different modes. And that may sound easy, but it actually isn't, because we are so, and this is what we have to acknowledge, notwithstanding what it says in the Department of Transportation Act, many of us are still stuck in modal cultures. And recognizing that there are opportunities for cross-fertilization doesn't come naturally. And so it is certainly, it's the role of the Office of the Secretary, it's the role of the Office of Policy, I would say, in the Office of the Secretary, to really try to engage the modes and find those commonalities and opportunities for cross-fertilization. But process-wise, it's still a work in progress. And so we appreciate the prod that your report, the GAO's report, put under us, but I think we still have to respond to that in a greater way. The Office of Intermodalism, Paul, is now in RITA. Again, a source of some criticism, particularly from Chairman Oberstar, who's just here. Our answer to that was intermodalism is not meant to be the province of an office. It's meant to be suffused throughout the culture of the entire Department of Transportation. But what do you think RITA will be doing looking forward through data management, through the Office of Intermodalism, in order to continue from its perspective as an intermodal administration to further this culture?
Well, having been at GAO and on the Hill and even in DOD, I look a lot at how do you affect cultural change? Because really that's what we're talking about here. And you affect cultural change in a couple of ways. One, finding high-value examples that you can hold out. And I think it's one of the things that the Secretary and I talked about during our interview process is how can we use research as a way to stress intermodalism? And by the way we're managing that portfolio and our approach, I think we're going to achieve that. And I think, frankly, through the governance process that we're applying to the research portfolio, it will actually help us reduce the historical barriers to the modal stovepipes. I mean, we just had a meeting the other day where we had the modal administrators in, and we were all talking about our common goals for the department around research. And with the intermodal portfolio, we're really focusing in on that. And it's also the direction that we give the 60 university transportation centers and some changes that we're trying to effect through the reorganization of the Volpe National Transportation Center to get it out of the historic modally focused stovepipes and into a more multimodal or intermodal approach to looking at things like, frankly, the movement of freight and the movement of people. Because by its very definition, it requires a system of systems. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it bears repeating because it's all on how you approach that view. It's how you reinforce that view. It's how you invest in that view. And we're just going to keep pounding on it until hopefully it impacts the culture.
Thanks, Paul. Are there any further comments from the panel about anything any of your colleagues on the panel have said? And if not, are there any comments from this very knowledgeable and very distinguished audience? Langhorne Bond.
As an alumnus of the Secretary's office and a modal administrator, I feel free to give advice to my betters. When we started out 40 years ago, we were just seeing the Shinkansen Railway built in Japan. It's been 40 years, and we don't have one here, and we are now the only developed industrial state in the world that does not have a fuel-efficient, high-capacity, 200-mile-an-hour TGV-type railway in the United States. I said to Norm Mineta 7 years ago that the one great undone project of this department is the construction of a modern TGV-type railway from Washington to New York to Boston. And we have satisfied ourselves with half measures through Amtrak. Now is the perfect time to endorse that, because as an air traffic control guy in the later parts of my life, I can tell you that all the things that we can do for the New York Metroplex will not begin to meet the demand in the New York airports and up there. So some other solution to this is mandatory, and there is no better or known solution to this than a true passenger-only high-speed railway. And if the secretary or the deputy secretary like to hang some, as President Johnson would say, skins up on the road, that is one that will forever make them in this department historical.
Thank you, Langhorne.
Can I say something?
Yes, Rob.
I don't disagree with the comment. I do want to point out, though, I'm going to put my Norfolk Southern hat on for a moment, which is where I work, that, of course, in Japan, they move less than 5% of their freight on a ton-mile basis on railroads. In Europe, according to the European Commission, it's 8%. In the United States, it's 42%. This is for intercity freight movement on a ton-mile basis. And that is done virtually without any governmental support. That is not at odds with the comment that was just made. I like the part about passenger-only trackage. That saved your comment, in my view. But it is the case that we have in the United States a success story, but one which, again, in a mature market, requires re-looking at some of the opportunities for allowing rail to continue to reinvest. Right now on the Hill, we've got an investment tax credit. This is a blatant propaganda here, but we have an investment tax credit piece of legislation that, frankly, if it were passed, would release tons of private money for investment in intermodal facilities. And hopefully it will garner support.
Thank you, Rob. That was a success story. I think a success story is the way we ought to end this program. Better than the opposite. Before we end, I want to recognize a few people. First of all, Wilda Deer, my assistant, and Sharnika Harrison, our other assistant in the back, without whom this program would not have ever happened. Counselor to the Undersecretary, Suhail Khan, also instrumental in making it happen, and the man behind the scenes sitting at the mighty Wurlitzer, Anil Pillay, who's making the cameras work and the sound work and the pictures show up on the screen when we call upon them. Thanks very much to him as well, and to our multimedia team. Thanks to all of you for coming. This has been a great reunion for many of us. You will now be able to continue it in much more grand circumstances with food, music, and a presentation by the Secretary herself. So thanks so much for coming.